Hey guys, so welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to talk about the useReducer hook in React, and I'm going to see how to use the hook and how you do state updates using this hook. So let's get started. So having gone through the React use state and seen how easy it is to manage a component's state, we saw that it became a hassle to keep track of numerous state variables, and that's where the useReducer comes into play. So the useReducer hook accepts a function that helps us decouple state updates from a component into a separate file. So the function is called a reducer. So we're going to check out how it works. So what do you gain by this? So like what do you gain by extracting the state updating logic from the component? So the first thing we get is the simpler markup in the components, an easy to understand component without state updates visible in the markup. So using the useReducer syntax, we dispatch actions. So you dispatch an action like you on button click, you dispatch an action like increment age. And then you don't have the state update logic which is all over the place. So you just deal with the markup. The other thing is that it has a declarative tone in the state updates since it dispatches actions to the reducer functions. And then finally, the state is consolidated and the update logic is easier to work with. So in case you do updates, you don't have to go to the markup. So the first thing we start with is the useReducer syntax. So first of all, to use the useReducer function, the useReducer hook, you have to import it from React first, and then this is the function I was talking about. This is the reducer function. So this function is responsible for updating the state based on the action and any other data that comes in. So in case you are changing someone's name, you see you have that action of changing the name, and then you might want to have a new name. So that is always appended to the action. So the other is the syntax. So you have your basic hook, whatever it accepts, then the state, all that, and then so let me just open VS Code and we can start from there. Okay, so what I have here, let me just zoom in. So what I have here is a basic component. So this is a component that I just created, and this is just a simple React application. So you can see the source, it's a React application running on Vite. And then for entry point, we just render our component, which is called useReducer explained. So useReducer explained, which is this component. So this is the component we are going to be using. And the first thing we need to check out is the useReducer syntax. So the first thing we do is import useReducer from React. And then the next thing we need to check is the syntax. So as always, so this useReducer is a hook. You can start by calling the hook. And as you can see here, it accepts three arguments. So two of them are required and one is optional. So the first argument is the reducer function. So let's just create the function here. Let me use this function declaration. This is a function reducer which accepts two things. The first thing it accepts is the state and the action. And then here we say reducer logic. Okay, so the first thing it accepts is the reducer. And as I've said, the reducer accepts two things. So the first thing it accepts is the state, we said the state is whatever you want to track in your application. Maybe your application, this is the profile listing. You need to show maybe a profile of a person. So let me just show you a sample. So let me just say user is equals to name, and then you have the age. So the state is whatever you want to track in your component. So yeah, so the reducer function accepts two things, the state and the action. So state and action. Okay, as we shall see, the state, as I've said, is the data you want to track in your component. And then the action, by convention, the action is an object with the first key to be the type. So this is the type of action. Maybe you want to increment age. And then by convention, the other key is called payload, which now carries the data. So imagine you are updating a user's name. So you can say the action itself is update name, and then the payload can now carry the new name. I hope I'm making sense. So the reducer function accepts two things, the state and the action. So in our useReducer hook, we have to pass in three arguments. So the first argument is the reducer function. The next argument is called the initial arguments. So let me show you. So the second argument is called initial args. And then this initial args works by condition. So the initial arguments, let me just show you. So let's say we want to pass. Let me just create. So we have a name. So this is a user. I want to track this user. This is called TechWithTwin. And then the age is 40. So this one is called initial args. Then you pass in the initial arguments, like the initial args. So these functions work differently based on the third argument. So the third argument is a function. So I can call this function get initial state. So function get initial state, it receives one argument, which is the initial args. So it receives a user. And then this function should return the new state. So let's get this clear. So this third argument is optional. And then you pass in the function reference. You don't call the function, you pass in the function reference. So React is the one that will call this function with the second argument as its argument. So let me repeat. So it calls this function, passing in it an argument, which is the second argument of the useReducer hook. So I hope you get that. So this is the scenario one. So scenario one is when we have the third argument. And at the end, I'll show you why we need this. So let me recap again right now. So the useReducer hook accepts three arguments. So the first argument is the reducer function. This is the function responsible of updating the state. This is the function that you can transfer to another file. And then we do have the second argument, which it behaves differently based on whether we have the third argument or not. So in case the first scenario we have the third argument, you pass in the function reference. You don't call the function. Don't say get initial state like this. Don't do that. So React is the one that calls this function, passing it an argument, and this argument is the second argument in the useReducer function. Now, let's check the second scenario. The second scenario is whereby we don't have that argument. So as I said, that argument is optional. So if this does not pass, then this one becomes the initial state. Okay. If that function is passed, that function is the one that is responsible of returning the initial state after being passed in the second argument, which is the second argument of the useReducer hook. So most of the people, we don't use this unless we need to compute our initial state. I'll show you at the end. So what does this return? So this one returns okay. So this one returns an array of 2 items. So I also explained this in my useState hook. So if you did not check it out, so make sure you check it out. So this one returns an array with exactly 2 items. So the first item is the state, and the second item is a function called dispatch. This is the function which is responsible for dispatching actions to the reducer function. It dispatches these actions. I'll show you the syntax. So, and then as I explained in my useState tutorial, is that since this is an array of 2 items, there is something else called destructuring. So destructuring says if you have an array with 2 items, first and second, to create variables based on this, you have 2 options. So as I said, this function returns 2 values. So my return value here is 2 items. So if I want item 1, we said item 1 is the initial state. So we can say state is equals to my return value of 0. And then const dispatch is equals to my return value of 1. Okay. But by using destructuring, this is exactly similar to doing like this. We can say const state and dispatch equals to my return value. These two are exactly similar. So instead of declaring this variable and then reassigning it, why don't we reassign it directly? Then you are left with something like that. So to recap, you need a reducer, you need your initial state, or you provide a function that will be passed in the second argument to the useReducer as its argument, as I shown. So let me just recap. So function get initial state takes in a user and returns some state. So if you pass this function, you pass in the function reference. If you pass it, then React will call this function, passing in it this argument to it. And then this function is now responsible for returning our initial state. Okay. I hope that is clear. But in case you don't pass it, then this one becomes the initial state. All right. So let's see how actions are dispatched. So I'm going to create, let me just use a div here, then h2, then we can render state.h. Now I want to create an action to increment age. So these actions, you can give it any name you want, but by convention, the action is always passed like this. So action, so the action is passed in like this. It's an object with several items if you want or you don't want, but by convention, the first item is the type. Now this is what you want to do, the action, and then the payload. So the payload, in case there is something being updated. So the payload is always an object in case you want to update multiple items. All right. So as you might have noticed, I'm in TypeScript, and in TypeScript, it can help me annotate my state and my action. So I can come here and create a type called state, which is equals to, so takes in a name which is a string. This is annotating. If you're using JavaScript, this does not apply to you. But for TypeScript, it is very nice because you are able to annotate your state, and it prevents you from dispatching actions that are not present, because that would be catastrophic. Then our type of action, the action will have type. I want to create one. You can predefine all these, but for now, let's just use them. And then you come here and annotate your arguments. Now you cannot pass in any other action apart from this. If I have another action called decrement, I just come and add it here. Right? So now, whenever I dispatch an action, I have to dispatch an action that has exactly either an increment age or a decrement age. But in case I just have one, TypeScript will force me to use increment age. So I'll just show you how that works. So as we have said, the action itself is what determines what we shall do. So we can use if statements here and say if action dot type equals increment age, you return the new state. And you have to note something here. You don't mutate the state. You create a new state. So you don't say state dot age equals no. You have to create a new copy of the state. So this is destructuring state, and then add the age. Okay, so state dot age. Okay, and then in case the action doesn't match that, we can just return the state. But as you shall realize that this can get messy, so mostly people use the switch statement. So what are you switching on? The action type. Then you start writing your case. And my first case is increment age. And then I want to return. Copy the existing state using destructuring. You copy it, and then okay, so you copy the existing state, and then you update the values that you want. So I want to update the age, and then because it's an increment of an age, you just do age plus 1. Now state.age. So just do state.age plus 1. So this is destructuring. This one basically copies. So let me just show you because someone might be new here. So let me get into the node. So the first thing I can do is to create person1. Let me just use simple symbols, P1. So person1 is called P1. So if I say person1, if I want to create person2, I can say let person2 equals copy everything from person1. So person2. Okay, I hope you are getting. So this is basically copying everything from person1. But now you can copy, let's do person3. can copy everything from person 1, and then if something else exists from, if you add a new one, so if I say name now is P3, if I add a new item here, and then this item happens to be on the copied, now this one will be exactly equals to this one, name P1. So if there are two of them, the later one is taken into place. So this time, this one will override the initial name. Then you say person 3, you can see. So this is exactly what you're doing here. Copy the existing state. The existing state has name and age. And then if I come here and override the age to a new value, this is what will take precedence. And then I can have a default case where I return the state. Okay, not like that. Yeah. So I hope it's clear. So let me just return. So this is case increment age. And then on a default case, return state. Okay, all right. So the reducer function should return the new state. So point to note here is that if the reducer returns the same previous state, then React does not re-render the component. It skips the re-rendering for performance purposes. So it basically compares the whatever you have returned in your useReducer versus whatever is existing. So having done that, let's first run our project. So I'm using pnpm, so we can essentially run this. So I mean, I don't know whether I should make this big. Style, font size, 20 rem. Hey, that's too big. That's too big. So okay, we can do that. We can do that. So our age is 40 now. How do we update the age? Now, using this dispatch function, you dispatch actions. Then the actions you dispatch has to match this type because I'm using TypeScript. So let me just show you. So below here, I'll create a button. Increment age +1. So then on click. So on click here, you have to pass a callback function because this function is not being called. This one is just a function reference or a function definition because this is exactly similar to this. Okay. So this is an anonymous function that is passed in here, but we are not calling the function. The function will be called when a click event happens. That's why we pass in a function here. So we dispatch an action of type. You see now the beauty of TypeScript. Now I can dispatch an action with the increment age type. And then what happens? So this one pushes this action. React catches that, calls the useReducer, passes the current state, and then the second argument is whatever you pass into the dispatch. And then inside our dispatch, we start checking. So we switch on the action.type. And then in our case, for the increment age, we return a new state. Then we override the state with state +1. So let's just first run this. You see, this is our button. I hope you can see it. If I increment now, it starts working. Okay. You can see. So I hope we are clear on that. So just to recap, so this is how the flow goes. We started with our useReducer. It takes in 3 arguments. The first one is the reducer function. The reducer function is what is responsible for updating our state. The reducer function takes in 2 things, the state and the action. Then we do all these checks to check what action is being carried out so that we can update our state and return the new state. Then React re-renders the component with the new state. As I have explained about this, if you pass in your initial state, you can see your initial state is name and age, is a user profile. And you don't pass the third argument, this one becomes the initial state. If you do pass the other argument, then React will call that function, passing in it this argument here. So the next thing we are returned here is the dispatch. This is what dispatches actions. You can see how this declarative it is. So whenever a button is clicked, we dispatch an action called increment age. Okay. So the next thing we need to check is, so what is the next? So let me just create a new one, or need to create a new case for decrement age. So you can call this any name, but by convention, just use a readable name and use that naming convention whereby everything is caps. So then is the state. Then we override the age to state dot age -1. Since we don't have this, we can come here and add an or. Okay. And then now here, we can come and add a button. Let's just copy this and then decrement age -1. And then here we call decree. Now you see the beauty of TypeScript. It cannot allow me to, let me just show you if I try to dispatch an action that of type, you see now. It accepts my type to be either the decrement age or an increment age. Okay, so if we go back, we have increment 64, 63. Then everything is working as expected. So yeah. So I'll give you a homework to look at. You can check how to use the payload. So if you want to add something here, you can see the payload is. So what payload do you want to pass? You want to pass an object. So I want to give you that as an assignment. So the assignment is how to pass in the payload and change the name. So pass in a payload and change the name. I would like to see this in the comments, your solution, so that I can go through them and see what you are up to. So it's basically simpler because now when you're dispatching an action, if you dispatch an action, let me just show you what you shall do. You can come here, useReducer React. You can come and try to see. I want some that has an update name. You can see it's very simpler. Because if the action is change name, then we call the action dot next name. But mostly just use the payload because it's simpler. So this one is basically using the next name. You dispatch the action and then pass in the next name. So that's your assignment for the day. Okay. Yeah. So if we can continue, I think we're almost done. Let me just zoom out a little bit. So we did dispatch different actions here. And then, so the final thing I want to show you is that, to tell you is that when dispatching actions on a click event, so in case we had a function here under increment constant or increment click, let me just use a function handle increment click. So if we did this, then you pass in. So if you had multiple stuff going around here, do this, do this, do this. There's a concept I talked about called batching in React. So this awaits all the function in an event handler to finish. So if you dispatch an action here to increment and you dispatch another actions here to increment, let me just show you. So what do you expect here to happen? So we are starting with the any age of 40. We have incremented 3 times. So what do you expect us to see? I'm guessing it will be 41. What about you? No, it's 43. So let's see. So you pass an action with the increment age. So batching in React essentially says if you have multiple state updates in a component, in an event handler. So I showed this using the use state. The previous value, so let me just show you. I think this one needs a payload. Okay. I think this one needs a payload because now this one is, the increment is happening here. Now in case we are not having an increment, let me try this. Let's see. This one is 39. That one goes to 40. So whatever I'm saying is, by batching, it says, let me just show you in the React docs. Batching. So I don't know where the batching, we're talking about batching here. Okay. Okay. Handle click. Dispatch. Console. Oh, okay, this is it. So if you dispatch this action and console log the state dot age here, so we did increment this. So here, what do we expect to happen here? And finally here. So let's see. If we go back, then inspect. So I want this one to be docked on the side. So, all right. So we do see only 40. So the console log here, we saw 40. And here 40. So what is happening? So whatever is happening is batching, because React will have to wait for all this code to run for it to re-render the function, the component. Okay. Yeah. So that it doesn't. So because if you update here, it re-renders, then there was another click. Then that's why we have batching in place. All right. So your assignment for the day, we said how to update the name to a new name given in an input field. So let's check whether there's something I've left out. Okay, I've talked about the dispatch function, whatever it does. Okay. These are the explanations. All right, so avoid recreating the state. So the reason we had this functionality so the reason we don't pass in get initial state here is because, like, let's say we have function that returns user. This is a wrong thing to do because during the first render, React will get the value of the initial state from the function. And then it should ignore all the recurring renders. But now here is the issue, because since we have a function, this function will get recreated each time we have a render, a re-render or a render, which is a bad thing. And it is causes a performance issue. So what you can do is that pass in the user and then get, maybe you have a username here, and then get initial user. Then now this one receives the username. So this is what I told you. Maybe you are getting from a DB, get, or whatever you are doing. So this is the syntax you should be looking at, because this value will be passed to this function, and then that function returns the new state, and then recurring renders, this function won't be recreated, nor will it be called again, because its use was to get the initial state. Right. Okay. Let's see the last thing. So you avoid recreating. And then that's it, guys. So that's it for our tutorial today. Make sure to check out that how to update the name using a payload. Okay, because now if you you come here to the action, the convention is to use a payload, and then you can say next name, which is a string, and then you can do something like that, and then you go ahead and create so you go ahead and this one is also option. This one is not optional now. So you go ahead and create an input field, track that input field's value with the new state, and then whenever someone updates, it updates. So that's your use case, your tutorial, the task for the day. And thank you for watching. Or make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. Have a great one.